Hello and welcome to LdEduTalk. Today we have Renee Lamborn to talk about how to work with the schools. I am Beth Powell with the Reading Clinic.
I'm Dr. Lynn Baldwin, a learning coach.
And I'm Renee Lamborn, a special education advocate and consultant.
So let me start things off by introducing our speaker for today. Renee Lamborn, she's a special education advocate. She brings over 19 years of experience, first in the public school setting in the Bay Area here, as a school psychologist, as a director of special education, as well as a Section 504 coordinator. And then she's worked in a private advocacy practice. That's what she does right now. She's an educational advocate. So her work as an advocate, as a director of special ed, working with the public schools as a school psychologist, she's gained a very broad as well as deep understanding of a unique variety of disabilities, placement and service options for children, as well as legal issues involved with working with the schools. So Renee brings very unique inside perspective, and she's established relationships throughout the Bay Area with school districts, and she really works to establish collaborative agreements and solutions. She's got an effective communication style. She knows how to do conflict resolution, and she brings these skills to affect positive outcomes for children. So without further ado, Renee.
Thank you. So I'll be talking today about how parents can access reading supports through the public school system. I'm starting this presentation with the assumption that you have already identified that your child is struggling with reading. Some of the earlier talks did an excellent job of discussing the signs and characteristics to watch for. My talk is primarily based upon the idea that your child is in school for 5 to 6 hours each day, and that it's really critical to maximize the school-based supports and to work to complement any of the private interventions that you may already have in place. As an advocate, parents often come to me asking how to get support, what supports to ask for, when to ask for those supports. So what I'll be focusing on is, in this presentation, are some of my answers to those questions. So as an overview of what I'll be talking about, the first concept is preparation for approaching the school. So we'll be talking a lot about how to gather data in preparation for that. Once you've gathered the data, we'll talk about how to request a student study team meeting, which will be the place to gather information and ideas about strategies. We'll talk about exploring general education supports. If those supports are not sufficient, we'll talk about special education supports. And then I'll wrap up the conversation with just some particular tips and tricks to keep in mind. So let's start at the very first step, which is gathering data from various sources in preparation for approaching the schools. So I always say that nothing speaks more loudly than data, and that's really because nobody can argue against data. Vague suspicions, observations, everyone can have their opinion, but data is data. So let's talk about the different sources that you can look to in order to gather that data. So report cards come out 3 times a year. They are standards-based and really an excellent way to monitor a child's progress. Are their grades going up or down? And are they meeting standards in all areas? The parent-teacher conference is also an excellent place to gather data. I always advise my families to take notes. The classroom teacher will be giving you a wealth of information and examples, and it's really important to capture those. The district will have district-wide assessments, and usually those are administered 2 to 3 times a year. Most often schools will offer that information, but feel free to ask to see that information if it's not offered to you. The district will also do state-mandated assessments, and you will, of course, receive those results as well. Sometimes individual teachers like to administer their own assessments. Usually it's for their information, but again, you can request that information. And then I always ask parents to create a folder and to start to gather work that is coming home. So tests, writing samples, reading logs. You can also gather your observations of what's happening while your child's reading. As an example, maybe they skip lines, maybe they insert different words, maybe they read words backwards. Whatever you're observing as you read with your child, go ahead and put that all into that folder. And lastly, some families seek a private assessment report. And the private assessment really allows a family to get an in-depth understanding of where the reading process is breaking down for their child. So once all of that data is gathered, it's important then to have a forum for where to discuss this data and what options are available to address those areas of need. So all schools have what's called a student study team meeting. Sometimes it's called the student success team, but if you say student study team meeting, all schools will know what you're talking about. The student study team meeting is a group that meets regularly throughout the school year, and they discuss students who are struggling academically, behaviorally, socially, and or emotionally. It's really a place to brainstorm solutions and to document the discussion. It's really critical as you move into this process of requesting supports from the school to document your journey by creating a paper trail. And you will leave that student study team meeting with a document of everything that's been discussed. So the student study team meeting can be generated by you or any staff member. It's really easy for you to initiate the process by sending a quick email to your child's teacher or principal requesting to hold the meeting. At the meeting, you will be in attendance. Any additional professionals or non-professionals that you would like to invite, maybe a private assessor, a private tutor, a neighbor. The classroom teacher will, of course, come. An administrator, such as the principal or assistant principal, will attend, and then other staff members as appropriate, such as a reading specialist or a special education teacher. In the meeting, the team covers a very set number of areas. So they'll start with student strengths, since it's very important to utilize the child's strengths in formulating interventions. For example, if we know that a student learns best through visual channels, we'll be sure to incorporate visuals with verbal information. The team will also look at the known information in the history. That might include developmental information, test scores, grades, any private information that you have, formal diagnoses. Next, the team will look at areas of concern, and I always advise families, be really specific here. Don't just list reading, but really detail where in the process of reading it's breaking down for your child. So that might be decoding, that might be phonological awareness, that might be comprehension, that might be fluency. So really get specific, because the areas of concern drive the interventions, and we want to make sure that the interventions are addressing all areas of need. So next, the team will look at what strategies have already been implemented, and they'll also list anything that's been tried in the school and privately, it's actually a legal mandate for the school to exhaust all options prior to considering more restrictive supports such as special education. Next, the team will move to, now that we have this information, how will we address these reading concerns? And I'll talk a little more in detail with the next slide about what you might be asking for. The team will list who will be responsible for implementing those strategies and by what date. And this is really the place for you to ask the team to talk about all reading intervention supports that are available within the schools. I always say that schools don't provide parents with a menu of options to choose from, so it's your responsibility to ask and to become educated on what is available. And lastly, the team will set up a review date to determine the effectiveness of the agreed upon interventions. Average range is 45 to 60 days later. I always say that we take our best guess as to the solutions that will be effective, but it's really imperative that we come back to see if our guess was correct, and then to fine-tune or revise our interventions based upon the data. So let's talk a little more in detail about what types of supports are available within the general education setting. So schools have implemented what is called response to intervention, which is a gathering of general education supports that really tries to address at-risk students from a preventive angle. So they tend to target students early in the process with the idea that they can support them with early intervention so that they don't need more intensive support such as special education down the road. So generally when we're thinking about ways to support a child's reading, we are thinking about a couple of ways to intensify that support. So one is we think about how do we increase the amount of time that they're spending receiving reading instruction. If the classroom spends 60 minutes a day on reading, how can we build another half hour of reading instruction into the day? We look at whether the child needs access to smaller instructional groups as opposed to whole class groups. We look at how we can increase guided practice reading, and we also look at whether we need precise targeted instruction in a specific area of reading in order to close the gap. So let's talk about some very specific examples of what you might find on a public school campus. So a couple of options are looking at one-on-one reading support. We can also look at small group reading support, and those can be either in the classroom or outside of the classroom. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I have one student who is pulled out of class every day to work intensively with a reading specialist and 2 other students. So he participated in that intervention for about 2.5 months. There was careful data collection, and he was actually exited after 2.5 months because he had gained the skills that he needed so that he could fully participate in general education classroom. I have another student who reads every afternoon for 20 minutes with a kindergarten teacher who does not have a class in the afternoon. So it gives that student a significant amount of practice every single day. I have other clients at schools where volunteer parents have been trained in a curriculum called Barton, and their students who participate in that program receive one-on-one instruction, careful data gathering in order to monitor their progress. And I have another client who accesses a special education program called the Learning Center. So both general and special education students receive intensive small group instruction several times a week. The other option that you can explore with the team is whether they have any before or after school reading programs. Sometimes they're called academies, and schools are really trying to lengthen the school day to provide that additional reading support. On a campus, there are many different staff members who can help with providing the additional reading support. So the classroom teacher might do a whole class lesson and then pull one or two students to the back in a small group to reinforce what was taught. Sometimes a reading specialist is assigned to the school campus several days a week, and they too will offer pull-out small group reading intervention supports. Sometimes there are teachers on special assignment who are assigned to specific schools, and then each school always has a special education teacher that general education students may or may not be able to access. So after we have exhausted the general education supports and the data supports that the student is not making sufficient progress, we then begin to explore special education supports available at the school site. So we start that process by writing a letter or sending an email to the principal requesting a full special education assessment to determine if your child is eligible to receive special education services. So without going too much in depth on a very complicated process, essentially a student has to meet one of 13 eligibility categories in order to qualify for special education services. The criteria are designed to be very black and white. Your child either meets the criteria or they don't. And unfortunately, special education is an after-the-fact support. And it's really designed to support students who have already failed. For example, students who are 1.5 to 2 years below grade level. That's why in the earlier slide I was speaking about response to intervention. That is our only preventive option to address the reading. So once a student is deemed eligible to receive special education, the team will develop an IEP, which will detail annual goals that the student will work on, special education services, accommodations, etc. And two of the main academic supports that are available through special education are the Resource Specialist Program and the Special Day Class. So the Resource Specialist Program is a trained special education teacher who pulls students out of their general education classroom to intensively remediate specific academic areas such as reading. Students can be pulled out for about 2 to 2.5 hours a day, with an average amount of time being pulled out around an hour a day. If the Resource Specialist Program is not sufficient, a student then might move into what we call a Special Day Class. This is a small class of 10 to 12 special education students taught by a special education teacher with one or more special education aides. So the student spends a good majority of their day in that special day class intensively receiving academic remediation. So lastly, I want to talk about just some tips and tricks when you're thinking about accessing either the general or special education interventions in the school. So first of all, it's really important to think about what curriculum or program is being suggested and whether that program matches your child's needs. So as an example, there are some curriculums that just focus solely on decoding, although reading comprehension may be your child's area of need. So we have to be careful and ask a lot of questions about the program or the curriculum that is being offered to make sure that it seems to be a good fit. So you can also, if you have a private assessor or a private tutor, you can also talk to them about the curriculum that's being offered, what curriculum they might be using, because they'll have really valuable insight about whether that is a good fit or not. If it turns out that the school's curriculum is not successful and the data show that the child is not making progress, then you can go back to the team to talk about another curriculum or another program. So the second tip sort of goes back to my comment that nothing speaks more loudly than words. So when we put a reading intervention or program into place, it's really important for the parent to ask how and how often that data will be collected so that we know whether the program is effective. We certainly don't want to implement it for a school year and come back at the end of the year to find out that the child has made little to no progress. So usually what I have families do is request to meet informally with whoever is implementing that reading intervention to look at the data and talk about whether it seems to be an appropriate fit. Another important strategy is if you have a private tutor or educational therapist working with your child, it's really imperative to make sure that you open up the lines of communication between the school and the private staff so that they are coordinating their efforts, so that they aren't reinventing the wheel, so that they can share successful strategies and reinforce them in both locations. And lastly, I want to talk about really working collaboratively with the school team. So school teams are limited by funds. They're limited by what is available at their school site, and it's really important to maintain a really positive working relationship with them as you explore what those options are.
I think, can I kick off, Beth, with the first question?
Yeah.
All right. So let's back up. Talked about preparing for a student study team meeting. Is it useful for a parent to go to the effort of preparing like a here's my child one-page sheet with a photo of the child and with maybe a summary bulleted lists of strengths and maybe concerns? Because you're going to bring so much information. I'm just thinking of something that tries to condense it from the get-go.
Absolutely. So after gathering all of the data to support the fact that, yes, this child is struggling, we do have to compile it and think about a way to present it to the team. So I have some families that will create sort of one-page documents. And in today's technology world, I actually have some families who create PowerPoints to present to the team. So definitely helpful either way as a way to present that information.
Okay. Next question goes to you, Beth.
Okay, we'll start with my usual standards. So it's what is kind of your major pet peeve around reading instruction and what you see as an educational consultant? And then you can follow that up with what would your one wish be to help improve reading instruction or the experience of students through there.
So the first question is, what is my biggest pet peeve around reading instruction?
Yeah, in your role as a consultant.
Probably the eclectic approach to reading. And you know, when we're pulling from different curriculums and sources, I have no way to say what's effective and what's not effective. And I think my second pet peeve is also the timing of interventions. So what I have listed out are the sequential steps that we go through, and I speed the process up by bringing that team back together every 30 minutes. Otherwise, we can go 4 months, come back together and find out, oh, that didn't work. And now we're back at square one and we're starting again, and we just wasted 4 months of that child's life. So those are probably the biggest pet peeves.
That's a really excellent piece to talk about, actually, because that is the ability to look back at what you've done and think about, is it working? Because one of the hazards I think people run into, and it's such a delicate balance of, well, we have this program and we're using it, and I think sometimes people get stuck in the program. Even though it's not being effective, it's like, well, it's an effective reading program, so it should work. And I think sometimes people linger too long. But on the flip side, exactly, that you can't also be going just willy-nilly all over the place. And so that's a really great way to kind of sort of dovetail those two concerns. Just checking in, is the student making progress? And one of the questions that really brings up for me is, what do you consider to be, what looks like progress from your perspective? Like, how would you define that?
I tie it all to data. So we always get information, you know, observational information. The classroom teacher will come into meetings and talk about, oh, I've seen a lot of improvements in reading. I feel like he's reading more fluently. That's all very critical information. But really, in my head, what I'm saying is, show me the data, show me the data. And again, a lot of the curriculums are now building in ongoing data collection. Response to intervention is actually based upon the premise of ongoing data collection, coming back together, adjusting what we're doing, what strategies we're implementing with that student in order to continuously fine-tune the interventions that we're using with students. Really, really critical.
That's great.
So I have another question, and this goes to when you spoke about RTI, Renee. Now, I think some parents, in fact, I've heard from some parents that are very leery of using RTI when they already have concerns about their child, and they're concerned that this is a way of delaying getting an evaluation or getting them into a 504 or an IEP. So how do you reassure those parents, especially in light of what you just said? So many of these kids, when they finally get to special ed, are pretty far behind.
Right. So I actually find a lot of success with response to intervention strategies, particularly for the schools that have really embraced the idea and have very systematic programs in place to address the struggling readers. Again, it is our only way to address reading from the prevention angle. A student cannot and will not access until they're behind grade level academically, because all of the categories for special education require us to prove a significant impact upon educational performance. And significant is typically 1.5 years below grade level, just sort of loosely speaking. So the response to intervention is a very critical step to go through in the process. Again, it also comes back to the legal mandate of the school to try all options before moving into special education or the IEP. And with regard to the 504 plan, which is a general education function where we list accommodations and what we agree to do to keep a child or to help a child be successful, it too is general education. So the 504 might include all of the response to intervention programs. That's what might be written onto either the student study team notes or the 504 plan. They're going to look pretty similar.
Beth, you want to go, or I have a follow-on?
Oh, you can have a follow-on.
Well, so I guess you mentioned how they have to fall behind. What about in terms of grade level? But what are you if you have a very bright kid, you know, intellectually gifted, and yet they might have something like dyslexia. So you know, they may be even at first reading at grade level, but they're gonna fall behind. They're certainly not meeting up to their intellectual potential. Does RTI address that?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, the public school system, and I say this loosely, is committed to students being average. So their responsibility is to make sure that a child can sit in a general education classroom, receive passing grades, and meet the majority of grade level standards. They have no obligation to ensure that a student is functioning at their superior intelligence level. And that becomes very tricky for families to figure out what to do about that piece. So as long as that child is successful in a general education classroom, the school district has met their obligation. The other piece to keep in mind too is that particularly for very bright students, their intelligence will carry them quite a long ways before we see a significant impact, because they can compensate very, very well. And at some point it will catch up to them. Special education in particular is not concerned about what might happen, but what has already happened. So again, somewhat of a broken system in that we don't step in to prevent issues that may happen down the road. We fix them after they've already occurred.
And I'll follow that up with what would sort of be your biggest wish for it to change either the system or how reading instruction is implemented?
I think definitely for me, my focus is always on prevention. Those early years are so critical, so precious, and that is the time to wrap intensive supports around a child, not after the fact. So what I would fix is that we're spending all of the school's money and resources and efforts on the prevention angle, so that less students need special education services to close a gap down the road. So that's one of my biggest wishes. And I would love, response to intervention has been in place for a while now, but I do still see some very haphazard implementations of the idea. There are model districts out there that I see, and then I see districts that look at me like they have no idea what response to intervention actually is. So real discrepancies in the implementation of that idea. So I would love to see, because it's benefiting so many students on that prevention angle.
That's great. Yeah, we've actually we worked in a small group model at one point, and it was really fascinating to see some kids just take off running with that, and other kids you just knew they needed one-to-one. And so it was really, I think that model is really just a brilliant model, because it kind of helps filter out, when it's implemented correctly, it becomes obvious that, oh wow, this child's not going to be successful in even a small group, so clearly they need more one-on-one support.
Exactly, and one-on-one support can be available through response to intervention as well. So it can be there. Again, assuming they're using a well-researched curriculum that is a good match for that student.
Let me back it up just a second here, because I think many parents wonder when they should get, or if they should get, a privately based neuropsych evaluation or psychoeducational evaluation, as opposed to having the school do a special ed assessment. And so how do these two things differ, and what do you advise parents?
In terms of a private assessment is always a good option for a family for a couple of reasons. So even if a student pursues a special education assessment, those assessments are fairly standard in what they administer. So cognitive, academic, motor, auditory processing, visual processing. And the schools often have more limited assessment tools available to them than a private assessor has. So I always say that a school does an excellent job of administering sort of the basic assessments. They do it well, they're trained, it's standardized. Let's let them handle that component of it if we're moving in that direction. A private assessor, on the other hand, has an infinite number of assessment tools. So if the private assessor sees a particular area of weakness, they have another follow-up assessment that will go more in depth. The other piece that I really struggle with in the school districts is that they typically will use one of two tests to measure academic performance and reading performance, and the two tests that they typically use are extremely poor. And I don't feel that they measure reading comprehension well. I don't feel that they measure essay writing well. And so I'm always sending parents out to get more in-depth assessment, particularly in the academic area, because there are just such better measures that give us really useful information in designing interventions.
And then isn't it the case also, I mean, I see a lot of neuropsych evaluations. I haven't seen a lot, I will admit, in terms of school-based assessments, but the private assessments will always go into a very in-depth recommendation section based on the diagnosis. And that's not necessarily the case with a school assessment, right? Because the school assessment is primarily about eligibility, or am I?
Correct. It's completely targeted around the eligibility question, and trying to see if the child will meet the various components of eligibility. So you're absolutely right. That's why they have sort of a basic standard package of tests that they use, because they're trying to answer those questions. If you can keep talking, I am going to walk away and be right back in just a second. But keep talking.
Yeah.
While we're doing that, I'm going to put up the sign again.
Oh, perfect. Yep. If anybody has any questions, please send them. And if you'd lower this, there we go. Send them to hashtag LdEduTalk on Twitter. We are monitoring that. And if you are not watching this broadcast live but have questions, you can still go ahead and ask questions via Twitter. And we will answer those after the fact, after this is aired.
Great. I'm here.
And I actually have a question just while we're on assessments. And I don't know if you've seen this, but one of the common things I see is there's been a test given, and they do some subtests within that test. And on one subtest, it'll be first percentile. And for people at home, first percentile means that essentially there's a serious struggle. You're very, very far behind the norm. In fact, you're in sort of the most difficult area if you're in first percentile. And then with the next subtest related to that same test will be in the 75th percentile, which means you're well above the average. And for some reason, and you may not know the answer, but I'm very curious, that is then considered to be average, because the two scores average out into a kind of an average score, despite the fact that one's an extreme difficulty and one is actually a big strength. And so I'm just curious if you've seen that and if you could comment.
Sure. So, and you're thinking about that in terms of special education eligibility, or? That might actually be with the catches. I've seen it on just as it does end up. It is through public school testing that I've seen this, so it might be the question of eligibility. It just seems very significant to me when somebody has something in the first percentile. that's an area of concern regardless of how it's impacting the eligibility. Absolutely. So part of the eligibility category for specific learning disability, it lists out the academic areas that are impacted. And I don't have it right in front of me, but I know that reading comprehension is one. Written expression, math calculation, math reasoning. So you can see that some of the reading subtests may or may not come up in that eligibility. One of them is not reading fluency. You could be at the first percentile in reading fluency, and unless that's impacting your overall reading score, which is often what's used to determine eligibility, that may not qualify you for special education. So schools often will use the broad scores in determining eligibility as opposed to the individual subtest scores. And that's mainly because of the way that the eligibility criteria is written.
That is very helpful. Thank you. That is a long-standing question of mine.
You're welcome.
Let me jump in with one about you advised in one of your last slides about parents to ask about the curriculum that's going to be used with the child for remediation, and you talked about the need for working with fidelity to the program. So, but once they have that information, what are they supposed to do with it?
In terms of, do you mean when the school says we're going to use Read Naturally or we're going to use SRA to support reading? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
So a couple of things. Parents can definitely gather more information. I think it's really important for parents to educate themselves so they can go online and look up those reading programs to get a good description of what they cover, how often data is collected, just to familiarize themselves. And then if they happen to be working with a private professional, this is where the private professional will really come into play in talking about, do we think that's a good fit? If it's a good fit but we haven't addressed reading fluency, maybe we add Read Naturally. So, you know, in one piece, I want them to know the curriculum and be familiar with it. And then if you have a private professional, they can absolutely weigh in. I do want to caution, though, that we don't get to dictate which curriculum the school uses. They always get first choice. That has played out in the courts, and we'll never get around that. If their first choice through data collection proves to be ineffective, the next time we sit back down at that table and we're talking about curriculum, we're in a much better position then to say, look, we've tried your curriculum, it was not the right fit, now we want to talk about using A or B curriculum.
So an add-on question to that, Renee. If you, so parents have brought in you as an educational advocate and you're familiar with these programs, I mean, one criteria I often hear is that it should be evidence-based, that you can show there's research that backs up the program. So but that's not a requirement for a school? You have to kind of wait and see if this thing works, or can you ask from the get-go for an evidence-based program?
Great question. So the vast majority of schools are now mandated to use research, scientifically based curriculums. So I don't see it as much of an issue these days. Most of what they're using has been approved by either the district, the state. There are approved lists that are floating around out there that really dictate what can and cannot be used. So I don't really see that issue come up very often, that it isn't a research base. Whether it's the right fit for a student, that's always the million-dollar question. But most of them tend to be research-based at this point.
And if you have
I'm sorry, Beth, one more add-on. So once they try a program, how long do you let it go before you decide it's not working? I mean, a year, 6 months, 3 months? What's enough to determine whether there's progress or not?
So as I said earlier, I'm typically meeting with that team about once a month, once every month and a half, to sit down and look at the data. So I'm definitely not going half a year. I would never go a year without determining, because I don't want to waste that child's time. If we sit down after the first 45 days or 30 days and the data looks great, we can see it, it's there in the numbers, everybody's happy, let's give it another 45 days and let's come back together. So it should be a real fluid process, because one of the complaints that I hear from families all the time, as I'm sure you have as well, is we get to the end of the year, there's no progress, and now we've just wasted a year. So that ongoing frequent check-in is just a really critical part of the process. And schools are getting used to that. They used to be a tad bit annoyed. Why do we need to meet that frequently?
Okay.
And, you know, once I give them the reason, we get into the pattern, and it becomes, you know, the meetings don't have to be 2 hours. It's here's the data, everything looks great, excellent, let's continue moving forward. Or if not, what are we doing differently in the next 45 days that will change that outcome?
Great, and so I just wanted to also clarify for folks that are watching, if you're not sure how to figure out, from your perspective, what your child should be working on, a lot of the videos that LdEduTalk has been putting on covers that area, and so it's the idea that if the schools are saying, oh, we need to work on fluency, but you realize your child doesn't actually understand how to read fundamentally, that they've just been memorizing, there's ways to collect data around that as well that you can bring to the meetings. And again, just go ahead and watch the other videos, and that goes into that more in depth. But I just want to reference that so people understand there are ways of really sort of systematically thinking about what is the actual area of need for the students. And as Renee mentioned, you may or may not be able to dictate it, but if you can collect data around that, it'll really help, I think, to support the case and ultimately just help the kids and make it easier for the schools, ideally. Yeah.
I've got a question here. Beth, go ahead. I've been asking a lot.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So it was kind of a follow-up to that as well. One of the pieces that we see is sometimes you might have the program dialed in correctly, but the kids just aren't receiving services often enough. So they might have been recommended, you know, half an hour a week, when really if they were doing it maybe 3 or 4 times a week, they would see the differences. And so I just was wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. Again, that sort of goes back to that fidelity piece. So each curriculum comes with recommendations for frequency and the length of time that it should be implemented. That said, sometimes they're a tad bit unrealistic. I've seen some curriculums that recommend 75 minutes a day, one-on-one, 5 days a week. Probably not going to see that implemented in the public school system. But a lot of them will say 45 minutes a day, small group, and that can be feasible for the group as well. So I really look towards what does that program recommend, and how can we squeeze that in to a school day. That also brings up another idea that I'd like to mention too, is that, you know, language arts blocks are typically 90 minutes a day, and 60 to 90 minutes a day, and I will often build in afternoon blocks of time for my clients to get an extra boost of reading. So it's sort of on top of that, but later in the day, and it could be outside of the classroom with another staff member, lots of different ways to make that happen. So just how we build that into the school day is often a struggle.
So Renee, does it have to be built into the school day, or if the only way to build it in, would the school allow the child to work after school in a RTI type program?
If the RTI, as I mentioned, there are some before and after school reading supports available for students through the response to intervention. Otherwise, teachers have union contracts that dictate that they do not work before and after school. So if a program has been set up, it means the union has approved it. Teachers are getting paid for that time. But in general, no. It has to occur during the school hours, which is why we try to get creative with, oh, we'll do it later in the day. The student will miss something, but I always say that it's really important that I always say I'll give up everything to teach this child how to read. I'll give up history, science, art, computer lab. I'll give it all up if we can get more intensive reading support for this child.
So I've got another question, Beth, unless you've got one. And that is, what advice you would give to parents? This is kind of backing up again, but this would be in terms of informal observations at home, either in terms of preparing for an SST at the very beginning, or even to see on the home front. I mean, if they're only seeing an impact at school and they're not seeing anything at home, maybe it's not working so well as the school may think. So how should they be gathering formal observations? What guidance would you give parents?
Yeah, so usually what I have families do, most families are reading with their child on a regular basis. Either they're reading to them and asking comprehension types of questions, or what do you think will happen next? Or they'll have the child reading to them every night, and they'll notice patterns in what they see. They're reversing letters, they're reversing words when they read, they're skipping words continuously when they read, they skip lines when they read, they completely guess based upon the initial consonant of a word instead of taking the time to sound it out. Those are all critical pieces of information that parents can just jot down in that folder that they've created when they're gathering all of that information. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about, is what are you noticing? What stands out to you? So that you can bring that piece, because parents spend a lot of time reading with students. They have a lot of input to give. So I've worked hard to think about a way to help them gather that all together in preparation for meetings.
Okay, I'm going to bring it even farther back. I just realized I don't know that we really talked about what an educational advocate is and why a parent might seek one out.
Sure. So in my work as an advocate, I typically support students who are struggling and are getting ready to maybe enter into a 504 plan, or families that are getting ready to do an assessment for special education services. And really what I do is a lot of hand-holding and a lot of educating families each step of the way. So it's really my job to educate families on the legal pieces, what the eligibility looks like, so that by the time they walk into a meeting, they're fully prepared. They have a full understanding of what to expect, what we're looking for. I help families gather data. I help families who are at impasses with teams. They'll come to me and say, you know, we're barely speaking at this point, so I can come in and really get that team back together, focused on that child. I help families, because of my work in the schools, I help families be really creative in how do we get that support in place. You know, not all supports have to cost money. And so it's really sort of knowing who's on that campus, how can I access them, to wrap supports around that child.
And I've got a sort of an add-on question, and that is, where is the child and the child's voice in all of this? From the get-go, you know, getting the prepared for some sort of intervention, and then throughout the process of remediation.
Excellent question. So it really depends upon the child's age. So younger students, I like to do a lot of my work with preschool, kindergarten, first, second, those critical years, so that I can get supports in place. But I also have clients, middle school, high school. usually by the upper elementary levels and middle and high school levels for sure, the student actually attends those meetings. And as an advocate, I meet with those students, I gather information, I ask a lot of questions because some of them are not well versed in presenting to a group of adults. So I want to make sure, just in case, that I have information that I can bring to say, here's what we talked about. So they have a direct voice often in the process, the older they are, and that also comes into play for the interventions that we put in place. You know, younger students, we say, here it is, we put it in place and off we go. Older students really have a say. You know, no, I'm not doing that because it will make me stand out. So we have to get creative about how are we going to deliver that service? Where are we going to deliver that service?
Okay, I'm glad I asked that question.
Great. Well, we're actually at time, so thank you so much. That was really, I actually learned quite a bit during this one. It's such a complex process. I'd never heard it mapped out in such a great way, so thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right.
So long, everyone.
Bye.